When it comes to India, I think it's fair to say that one of the biggest, most talked about aspects of its social fabric is this system of reservation. And judging by the stuff you said over, you're really keen to get into the nitty-gritty of this, huh?
Yeah, absolutely.
It's complex, no doubt about it. So, in this deep dive, what we're going to do is we're going to unpack what exactly reservation in India is, how it actually works in practice, and we're also going to try and untangle all the, well, sometimes pretty heated debates that swirl around it.
Yeah, and I think the excerpts you've provided give us like a really solid foundation. We have a broad overview, there's different perspectives, a bit of background, even a personal take on it. So our mission here is to kind of, synthesize it all, boil it down to help you really grasp the core of what's a pretty multifaceted, crucial issue.
Okay, so let's jump right in. When we say reservation in the context of India, what are we actually talking about here? Like, what does that system look like in action?
Okay, so basically, reservation in India is a type of affirmative action.
Hmm.
And you can think of it as, like a mechanism where a certain percentage, a quota, if you will, of spots are set aside, ring-fenced, you might say.
Mm.
And these are set aside in things like universities and colleges, government jobs, even in political representation. And they're specifically for groups that have historically, experienced pretty serious social and economic disadvantages.
And we're not talking about some recent policy here, are we? This is something pretty deeply rooted in how the country is structured.
Exactly. It's baked right into the Indian Constitution.
Yeah.
It's like fundamental. And the main aim here is to try and tackle, these really deep-rooted inequalities, social inequalities that stem from the caste system. And as we all know, the caste system is something that, subjected certain communities to, well, literally centuries of discrimination and being excluded. So reservation is, in a way, an attempt to sort of, level a playing field that was, well, never really leveled to begin with.
So when we're talking about who these reservations are meant to benefit, who are the main groups we're talking about?
All right, so the primary groups that are consistently identified as beneficiaries are the scheduled castes, often called SCs, the scheduled tribes, or STs, and then there's this wider category known as the other backward classes, that's OBCs.
Okay.
And these are the communities that the government recognizes as having faced, and in many cases still facing, this systemic disadvantage. And this disadvantage is really rooted in, the historical social structures.
Okay, so that gives us kind of like a snapshot of what it is, right? But what's the thinking behind it? What are the main arguments for having this system in place? What are the people who support it hoping to achieve?
Okay, so the strongest arguments in favor of it usually focus on this principle of social justice, right? So the idea is that reservation acts as like this vital tool to help uplift communities that have been marginalized for so long. You can almost think of it as like, giving them a boost, recognizing that centuries of oppression has put them way behind right from the get-go. It's about trying to create a fairer chance to get access to opportunities that were denied to them before.
Right, so it's not just about saying, oh, things are equal now. It's about actively trying to fix the wrongs of the past, give a better chance to those who've been held back.
Precisely. And it's also really closely tied to this idea of representation.
Mm.
So by reserving a certain number of positions across different sectors, the idea is that it ensures that these underrepresented groups, they have a voice, right? They're in the room where decisions are being made. And this ideally leads to policies and initiatives that are more tailored to their specific needs and concerns.
Yeah.
If you're not at the table, it's much harder to be heard, right?
Yeah, absolutely. That makes a lot of sense. And what about the economic side of it? What about the impact on economic disparities? How's reservation supposed to help with that?
Well, economic mobility is another big argument, in favor of reservation.
Yeah.
Because having access to quality education and stable jobs, like, in the government through reservation, can act as kind of like this escape route out of poverty, right? And it has the potential to break these cycles of poverty, economic hardship that have gone on for generations within these communities. And by giving individuals and families a chance, it offers like a more stable and secure future.
And, going through the material, something that stuck with me was the whole idea of cultural preservation,
Right.
especially when it comes to the scheduled tribes.
Yeah, that's a very distinct and very important aspect, right? Because for the scheduled tribes, reservation is also seen as a way to kind of, you know, help them integrate into wider society while also protecting their unique cultures, their traditions, their ways of life. It's about enabling them to participate without forcing them to assimilate and lose what makes them unique.
Right. So it's not just about the material stuff. It's about protecting their heritage, their social and cultural heritage. And then there's this whole thing about historical correction that you mentioned earlier.
Exactly, exactly. I mean, at its core, reservation is framed as this measure of repair. It's
Yeah.
like saying, look, we acknowledge that these injustices happened, that the caste system inflicted these wounds.
Right.
And it's about actively trying to right those wrongs, to address those disadvantages that continue to have an impact today.
Okay, so we've looked at the pros, the arguments for reservation. They're compelling, you can see the logic there.
Hmm.
But as you mentioned, it's often called a double-edged sword, right? Let's flip the coin. What are the criticisms leveled against how it works right now? What are the main points of contention?
So one of the most common debates is about, meritocracy.
Hmm.
Critics argue that when positions are reserved based on caste rather than purely on, like, grades or demonstrated skills, it can compromise merit, especially in, like, very competitive areas.
Hmm.
Top universities, prestigious government roles.
Right.
And the worry is that the most qualified candidates, objectively speaking,
Mm.
might be passed over for someone from a reserved category.
And you can see how that leads to a sense of unfairness, right?
Right.
Not just for the individuals who miss out, but even, on the whole, the quality and efficiency of those
Yeah.
sectors.
Yeah, it's a big concern. It's raised all the time. And another key criticism is that, look, by continuing to link benefits to caste, reservation might actually, even if unintentionally, perpetuate caste identity rather than helping to dismantle those very divisions. Like, some people say it actually keeps caste at the forefront of public discourse and reinforces those categories when the goal is to move towards a society where caste doesn't matter anymore.
It's interesting, isn't it? It's almost like a paradox. The very tool meant to overcome caste might be keeping it alive in a way. And what about who actually benefits within these reserved categories?
Right. That brings us to the whole creamy layer
Mhm.
issue. And the concern there is that, look, even within these reserved categories, it's often the relatively well-off families, the ones who are already better educated, who are actually able to access these benefits.
Mhm.
While the people who are most disadvantaged, who are in the same groups, might still be left behind. So it's like the target isn't always hitting the bullseye. There's like some leakage in the system.
Right. So even within those communities, it becomes a question of who's really benefiting. Right. And I imagine, for people outside the reserved categories, this whole situation can lead to resentment.
Absolutely. Especially among those from the general category. People who might be struggling economically themselves, but they don't qualify for these reservations because of their caste. And they might feel, well, hang on, this isn't fair. I'm disadvantaged, but I don't have the historical advantages that reservation is trying to counter.
Mhm.
And, this unfortunately can breed tension, resentment between communities.
And something else mentioned in the material was like the time frame, right? It was
Yeah.
supposed to be temporary, this whole thing.
Yeah. The initial idea was that reservation would be temporary, primarily for the first decade after India became independent.
Mm.
But not only has it continued, it's, expanded in terms of scope and the percentage of reserved places. And now, in lots of states, the total quota, it's pushing, even hitting that Supreme Court guideline of around 50%. And people are saying, well, hang on, where are the exit strategies? Is there an end date to this?
Okay, so let's zoom out a bit, look at the bigger picture. This isn't just a set of rules, right? This is all embedded in India's legal and political systems.
Oh, absolutely. So legally, Articles 15 and 16 of the Constitution, they're the foundation for reservation. They basically allow the government to make special provisions for what they call socially and educationally backward classes.
Mm-hmm.
And then you had that big 103rd Amendment in 2019, which added a whole other layer, right?
Yeah.
A 10% quota specifically for the economically weaker sections, the EWFT.
Mm-hmm.
And these are folks who aren't covered by the existing caste-based reservations.
Right.
So, yeah, more complexity, right? And it's key to remember that the Supreme Court has generally said, look, there's a 50% cap on the total reservations, but this cap, it's often contested. There's pressure at the state level, with loads of states wanting to go beyond that 50%.
And politically, it's a minefield, right?
Totally. I mean, reservations are a massive, often decisive electoral issue. Political parties are always promising new quotas, expanding existing ones. We see big movements demanding reservations for the Marathas, for the Patidars, for all sorts of groups. And sometimes you get the feeling that it's more about getting votes than about the original goals of the policy or who it's meant to help.
And one of the things, that really stood out in the material was this problem of data, or the lack of it.
Yeah.
We don't have recent, reliable information about caste demographics or how people are doing socioeconomically.
Yeah, that's a massive problem.
Yeah.
I mean, the last truly comprehensive census that had caste data. That was way back in 1931.
Wow.
I know, right? And they did a socioeconomic caste census in 2011, but the results, they've been debated like crazy and haven't been fully released.
Hmm.
So it's really hard to get an accurate picture of how different caste groups are doing now to know if reservation is still needed, if it's working. It's like trying to make decisions based on, like, a really old map.
Yeah, like an outdated map, exactly. And what about alternatives? Has anyone suggested other ways to do things?
They have. There's been talk about, maybe basing reservations purely on economics, regardless of caste, or maybe focusing more on general skills development programs, improving education for everyone.
Hmm.
But then people say, well, hang on, those approaches, they might not address the deep historical social side of caste discrimination in the same way that caste-based reservations were designed to.
Okay, so let's try to kind of like pull all this together now. What are the really key takeaways? What are the things that someone trying to understand this should, really grasp?
I think it's vital to remember that caste in India, it's not just like economic class, right? It's
Mm.
way deeper than that. It's about social exclusion, discrimination that's been baked in for centuries. It's about real lived oppression. And that fundamental difference is why, they came up with caste-based reservations in the first place. It was a specific remedy.
And the data, even if it's not perfect, it still shows that reality, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Even that 2011 census, the one with all the debate, shows that literacy rates for the SCs and the SE, they're still way behind the national average. It shows progress, sure, but it also shows, huge disparities still exist.
So it really is that double-edged sword we keep talking about.
It is.
On one hand, you have this tool that's needed to fix this really deep historical injustice, this inequality that's still there. But on the other hand, you have these built-in problems, unintended consequences,
Exactly.
the creamy layer issue, potential for resentment, all the debate about merit. It's all valid. And it suggests that maybe the system, while it's doing something good, it's not perfect and it needs to change.
Right. It needs to evolve.
And in the material, there was this talk about reform, not just getting rid of it altogether. Where could those reforms go? What could they look like?
So some of the ideas floating around include making the criteria for reservation more dynamic, more responsive, maybe link quotas to, real-time data on social and economic indicators.
Mm.
Another idea is to maybe phase out benefits for families
Yeah.
within those reserved categories who have clearly moved up economically and socially over time.
Right. So it's about making it more targeted, more adaptable, really reflecting how things are on the ground.
Exactly. It's
Yeah.
about finding that sweet spot, that balance between, needing affirmative action to fix historical injustices, but also having fairness, efficiency, and building a more harmonious society for everyone.
Well, this has been, a proper deep dive, a real eye-opener into something so complex, so debated. We've looked at what reservation is, the arguments for and against it, the whole legal and political landscape, and all the nuances, the challenges. It's a policy with deep roots, and it still has this huge impact on India today.
No doubt. It really highlights this balancing act that's going on, trying to bring social justice to communities that have been disadvantaged for so long, but also upholding those ideas of meritocracy and equality for everyone, regardless of where they come from.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into this, this multifaceted world of reservation in India, here's something to ponder. Given everything we've discussed, the history, the challenges today, what tweaks could be made to the current system, or maybe even what totally different approaches could be taken to tackle these inequalities in India? What would be most effective, sustainable, fair in the long run? It's a question that deserves some real thought and some continued conversation.